position. Mr Deputy Speaker, the time for recognising the State of Palestine was many years ago. With every year that has passed, the actions of the Israeli government creating facts on the ground, building and expanding illegal settlements, taking land and resources from Palestinians has only made it harder to bring this about. A viable, independent, sovereign state of Palestine based on the 1967 lines with the capital in Jerusalem. The UK should make clear that any future state must include both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. We do not at this stage have to specify precise borders. They may be agreed equal land swaps. And let us remember that when Britain recognised Israel in 1950, it did so without defining borders or its capital. For too long, in fact for over 40 years, successive British governments of all parties have claimed to support a two-state solution. Mr Deputy Speaker, this claim for Palestinians rings hollow. We recognise only one state, Israel, but refuse to recognise the other. The government position remains not now. But I ask the government, if not now, then when? Palestinian statehood, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a right to be recognised, not a gift to be given. It is in the power of the UK government to do so, and do so we should. We have acknowledged that Palestine has obtained the hallmarks of statehood. The refusal to do so sends out a dangerous message. It reinforces the view that we support and uphold rights for one people. We rightly recognise the State of Israel, but do not give recognisance to the rights of the other, the Palestinians. It shows we are not at all serious in our claims to back a two-state solution. Some argue that Palestinian statehood should be the outcome of negotiations. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, this allows successive Israeli governments who reject Palestinian statehood to have a permanent veto over this. If that is the case, why did we recognise Israel? We recognise Israel national rights, but not Palestinian national rights. We all want a proper negotiating process to start, to bring lasting peace to both the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. But it would be preferable that Palestine enters that process as a recognised sovereign state. It is essential that Israel knows that statehood for Palestinians is not something to be bartered over, but something that has to happen. Israelis are citizens of a state. They have fully fledged passports. They have a vote at the UN. Palestinians are stateless. At best, they have travel documents. They can only travel with the permission of the occupier, Israel. In fact, they can only leave Palestinian cities to go to another Palestinian city with the permission of the occupier. An Israeli soldier at a checkpoint can prevent President Mahmoud Abbas from leaving Ramallah. Palestinians have no say in the control of their land, water, maritime area, their airspace, and even their population registry. Let me address a point that anti-Palestinian groups make. Recognising a state of Palestine is not about endorsing a particular government or authority. We recognise many states, including Iran and Syria, for example, but have massive disagreements with their governments. As it is our diplomats meet and work with the Palestinian Authority. And for those who will inevitably say, well, what about Hamas? Hamas want a one-state solution, something we all disagree with. The longer we dither about recognising Palestine, the more potent Hamas's argument that there will be no two-state solution becomes. By failing to recognise Palestine, we undermine the Palestinian national movement that agrees to two states in favour of the likes of Hamas. We will be recognising a state under occupation. There is a precedent for doing that. In 1939, Stalin illegally incorporated Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia into the USSR. In 1990, the long Soviet occupation ended and they ceased to be states under occupation. On the ground, which I have visited, it is hard to see where this second state is going to be. The moment you enter occupied Palestinian territory, you are confronted with a terrifying infrastructure of military occupation, defined by walls, barriers, checkpoints, earth mounds, firing zones, military zones, all designed to control Palestinian civilians who live under Israeli military law, as they have done for the past 54 years. In a parallel universe, they now have over 650,000 Israeli settler neighbours living in illegal settlements, a violation of the 4th Geneva Convention and UN Security Council resolutions. These settlers live under Israeli civilian law. Two peoples living under two different legal systems in the same territory. Settlers have subsidised housing, fast transport access into Israel, and do not have to go through the checkpoints and barriers that Palestinians do. The settlers, with the collaboration of the Israeli military attack, harass and intimidate Palestinians to push them off Palestinian land. The levels of settler violence have gone up massively in the last few years. Violence and dispossession of Palestinians from their homes is systematic across the occupied Palestinian territory. Israeli settlers and soldiers act with impunity, and settler violence worsens, particularly in areas around Nablus and in the South Hebron Hills. These are not isolated incidents, but day in, the day out realities for Palestinians, whose lives and livelihoods are targeted by Israeli settlers, backed up by the Israeli state. To make way for the settlements, Palestinian homes and property are liable to demolition, whose families, men, women and children, are forced from their homes and land, even in the midst of winter storms. In Jerusalem, the situation is extremely tense, with a repeat of last year's conflagration all too possible. Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and other areas of occupied East Jerusalem continue to face the horrendous threat of forced dispossession and eviction from their homes. Only the other day, the Salem family in Sheikh Jarrah were given a temporary reprieve from being forcibly evicted from their home in favour of Israeli settlers backed by the Israeli state. Political pressure needs to increase. Our solidarity needs to match up with the realities faced by such Palestinian families. It is not enough that our consulate in Jerusalem simply bears witness as its neighbours, literally across the road, the Salya family, are forcibly evicted from their home and then to be demolished. We've all seen the scenes of Israeli police violence towards those protesting the forced evictions and dispossessions. We've all seen the far-right sit-ins and incitement from far-right politicians in Sheikh Jarrah, designed to abuse, intimidate and ultimately force Palestinians from their homes. The death to Arabs slogans and chants from far-right Israelis, which we heard in abundance last year, are as much part of the lived realities of Palestinians as the threat of forced dispossession is. Such is the level of systematic discrimination. Is it any wonder that the consensus is mounting among Palestinians, but also the human rights community too, that the situation of systematic discrimination amounts to the crime of apartheid? Who are we as British politicians to dismiss and gaslight the lived experiences of Palestinians who speak of apartheid and systematic discrimination? Why are we shocked when international human rights organisations such as Amnesty or Human Rights Watch come to the same or similar conclusions as many Palestinians have done so long before? that their situation amounts to apartheid. What is the government doing to end such widespread and systematic discrimination and oppression? The government may dislike the terminology, but the levels of discrimination cannot and must not be ignored. We watch today as a European country faces war and occupation, and we stand with Ukraine and oppose Russian aggression. And my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people. Quite rightly, we talk about international law. In fact, I listened to the Minister only a few minutes ago, and the vital importance of the sovereignty of states. Yet when Palestinians hear that, how must they feel? They have endured 54 years of occupation, which in itself is an aggression. Of course I will.
Great. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'm listening very carefully to her speech. If I might say respectfully to her that to conflate the situation in Ukraine, the invasion by Russia today, with the very difficult and sensitive situation that we are supposed to be debating this afternoon regarding Israel and the people of Palestine, it's historically wrong, it's factually wrong, I think it's morally wrong, and I think it does a huge disservice, not just to the people of Ukraine, but also to the people of Palestine and the people of Israel as well, who face a unique situation and set of challenges.
I thank the Honourable Member, or the Right Honourable Member, for that intervention. However, what I was talking about was the upholding of international law, which your own Minister actually talked about a few minutes ago. And the right of upholding international law is as relevant in Ukraine as it is in Palestine. They are looking to us to speak and act in the same terms. We sanctioned Russia over Crimea, and we are likely to impose more sanctions now, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Yet Palestinians ask why we do nothing to end Israel's occupation. Recognising Palestine now is the bare minimum of what we should be doing. In the light of what is happening on the ground, let me be very clear. It must be the first of many steps to roll back the inequalities of Israeli occupation and the systematic discrimination that oppresses Palestine. This should include a complete and total ban with illegal Israeli settlements. The international community has to hold Israel accountable, as it has held Palestinian groups accountable. As settlements are illegal, and the government states they are illegal, then the logical consequence of that is that we should not be trading or supporting in any way enterprises that are clear violations of international law, and as the government states, as an obstacle to peace. For any state, the strength of its civil society is absolutely crucial. We can also support Palestine through defending its civil society and human rights groups from systematic attacks from the occupying power. It is crucial that our government supports and encourages a healthy, prosperous and uninhibited Palestinian civil society, free from interference from the occupying power Israel and also from the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. If we are unable to fully pledge our support to Palestinian civil society, then what message does that send about our attitude to human rights as a country? We rightly pledge our support for human rights defenders elsewhere, but throw those in Palestine to the wolves. As parliamentarians, many of us would have met and have been briefed by organisations such as Al-Haq, DCI Palestine and Adamiyah, 3 of the 6 Palestinian civil society and human rights organisations designated without evidence by Israel as terrorist organisations. They are one of our most valuable routes into knowing what is happening on the ground. We must support them as parliamentarians and our government explicitly and publicly and defend their right to do their vital work without interference. In European capitals, we must hear from them and we must amplify their voices and those of Palestinians living under occupation and under systematic discrimination and oppression. Madam Deputy Speaker, logic, rule of law, fairness. History all tells us that Britain should have recognised a Palestinian state long ago. It is time to correct this, and we can now do that. The alternative to a two-state solution is clear, and I shall cite none other than the current Prime Minister on this, when he said 5 years ago, "You have to have a two-state solution, or else you have a kind of an apartheid system." Sadly, 5 years on, we are far closer to the latter than the former. I ask the Government to recognise the State of Palestine now.